An exhibit titled The First Step to Freedom, Abraham Lincoln's Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, traveled across New York State during the fall of 2012 to commemorate the document's 150th anniversary. Albany's New York State Museum was the final stop in its 8-city tour.
He begins, "I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy thereof, do hereby proclaim and declare that hereafter, as heretofore, the war will be prosecuted for the object of practically restoring the constitutional relation between the United States and each of the states and the people thereof, in which states that relation is or may be suspended or disturbed." Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, warning the southern states that were then in rebellion. If they didn't return to the Union, he would, in 1863, issue the Emancipation Proclamation and free the enslaved people who were enslaved in the states in rebellion. Essentially, Lincoln wanted to figure out a way to have a strong legal argument to support emancipation, and by focusing the Emancipation Proclamation on the states in rebellion, he was able to make it a matter of his extraordinary powers in war as president. And so he really made an important political decision, because there were slaves in the states that were controlled by the Union and in territories controlled by the Union. But the Emancipation Proclamation focuses on those enslaved people in the states in rebellion. And that was part of Lincoln's strategy to have a strong legal foundation for his issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, and also part of his strategy to make sure that the public in the Union understood that he was acting based on the need to win the Civil War. Part of what's powerful about the document is that it's not particularly poetic. When you read it, it is written in fairly legalistic prose, very different from the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural Address, where you really see Lincoln using lofty language and almost poetry to convey a message. This document is much more legalistic, because Lincoln understood that it might be subject to legal challenge, and that part of what he was trying to do was demonstrate that he was acting with legal authority from his war powers, and so he needed the document to read in that legalistic way. Some of the things I'd want to point out about the document, one is that you have the power of seeing the document in Lincoln's own hand. You have the places where Lincoln crossed out text and replaced it with other text. Originally, he was describing, and the executive government of the United States will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons. So he crossed out during the continuance in office of the present incumbents. And so you can see Lincoln making a judgment there about how he wanted to characterize the commitment that was being made in this document. Over here you have places where Lincoln actually cut and paste text from the Confiscation Act. And you have just over the word ninth, you have what looks to be a fingerprint, which we assume is Lincoln's fingerprint as a result of the paste that he had used to attach those excerpts to the document. There at the end you can see Abraham Lincoln's signature, as well as the signature of the Secretary of State. So there's something very powerful about being so close to a document that was created by Lincoln, this heroic figure in American history. The other thing that's powerful about the document, I think, at this moment in American history, is it really it illustrates a trajectory, right? The trajectory of American history that begins, in a sense, with the Declaration of Independence and this assertion of equality, which actually wasn't reflected in the reality of the time. But then you have the course of American history where there is this evolution, where slavery is ultimately abolished, where African American men at first are given the right to vote, where ultimately women are given the right to vote, where you have the civil rights movement, which is also highlighted in the exhibit. So you have this trajectory of American history, and so it's very powerful to see the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is a part of that trajectory, in some ways a fulfillment of at least a part of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. The speech by Dr. King was given 100 years after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to honor the centennial of the document. And in the speech, King talks about the need to fulfill the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation and the need to honor the notion of emancipation by providing true equality. The speech was given at the Sheraton in New York. I'm sure there was a lot of energy in the room, and also probably a real awareness on the part of the people in the room of the gap between the condition of American life and the condition of African Americans and the kind of lofty promise of the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation. One of my favorite lines is and actually it's not clear if he actually used this when he delivered the speech, but it is present in the draft. There's a line that reads something like, "We do not have as much time as the patient and cautious would give us." And I like that line because it captures the urgency of the moment and is in such contrast with the rest of the exhibit, right? In the sense that the Emancipation Proclamation is thought of as freeing the slaves. But freedom isn't real unless you have true equality. And that's the point that King is making. And that the time is late, that it's already been 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, and yet still African Americans don't have the full range of rights and freedoms as other citizens. Now, of course, when King is speaking, that's before the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So there is progress that follows that speech, but King really is capturing, I think, an important point about American history and about the extent to which America had, even by 1962, still not yet fulfilled the promise of the Declaration of Independence. So I hope when people leave the exhibit, they will leave with a sense of conviction that we have work to do to fulfill the promise of America, but that all the things that are right with America, that have been accomplished over American history, can be the source of energy that drives us forward in providing greater opportunity for all our citizens.